conflicts, wars, terrorism are producing millions of refugees. Xenophobia, hatred, Islamophobia are forcing us to question if mutual understanding and ideals ever existed in the first place. So exclusion replaced inclusion in the last years. And environment is also exposed to the destructive consequences of that fragmentation, which we have seen last year's environmental summits. The need to develop a collective response to our shared issues is desperately becoming more apparent. With this mind, fostering global consciousness is important is very important. So the first step is placing the notion of human security at the top of our agenda. And we believe that it is not just TRT, but everyone's responsibility to find a solution to the world's problems on all levels. And so the media is as well. And media networks also have a large share of the responsibility. As Malcolm X once did say, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that is power, because they control the minds of the masses.
But I wonder, is it the job of international news organizations to step in? You talk about social responsibility, but how much of a fine line is there between real journalism and social activism in a way? And where do politics fit in? Because for a network like TRT World, let's face it, which is based here in Turkey, Turkey has a real stake in what is going on in Syria. You have some 4 million Syrian refugees in the country. You've got troops in Syria as we speak. How much does politics determine what you cover and how you cover it when it comes to this issue?
We initiated a platform called TRT World Citizen. The main idea was not actually, okay, we are making humanitarian aid, not by the public sources, of course, by the source of the TRT World employees, but the main idea was to integrate the style guide, the editorial guideline we have with the life of the people that work for the TRT World.
But can it be done completely objectively, devoid of these political calculations?
We don't use, at TRT World, I don't use the word objective, but I use the word balanced, because you can't be objective as a human being. Sometimes there's right to do, and you are trying to be just balanced rather than being objective.
How do you look at the current discourse and narrative within the media, the mainstream Western media, when it comes to the issue of refugees and migrants, how they are depicted and how they are referred to, and how it affects your job as a humanitarian person?
The way many media are depicting the migrants in this moment is a way that is stealing their story, their dignity. When you label a person only as irregular, this is means that you are forgetting intentionally what they are fleeing from. That they are human beings with a story, with relatives, with their own feeling of belonging to a country that they were forced to flee. So this is something that is really concerning, that is increasing. Of course, the media, many of the time, are following the politicians in this. They are the first that started this way. And this is starting in discussing about the Western politics. And this is a reason more for being concerned.
But are many of these politicians right, in a way, to see the refugee issue as a security problem?
Yeah, but this is a problem. When it is only treated as a security, and dehumanizing the problem, it's increased the threat. It's not dealing with the problem that we normally face. When you treat and deal with the problem of the people, this helps us to simplify the dynamic at social level. I think that's the way the Western countries and Europe in particular is approaching this phenomena. It's just starting from the world. They started to call it as an emergency. denying that it was a phenomenon.
But now we speak to you here as president of the World Economic Forum. And I know that in this capacity, you've been in touch with highly influential people. I watched you interview just last month within the context of the World Economic Forum in Hanoi, one of those influential leaders who a lot of people are becoming increasingly critical of for not doing more on the question of the Rohingya, Aung San Suu Kyi. I just wonder, when we talk about this issue, and we know that there are close to 750,000 Rohingya refugees who've been forced to flee to neighboring Bangladesh to get some shelter there within the UN refugee camps, what do you make of the words that you hear from people like Aung San Suu Kyi?
And I raised with her the challenges now that the Rohingyas are faced with, and also the question of repatriation. Because 750,000, as you have said, have fled to Bangladesh, and what are the plans for receiving them back? And I also asked her in hindsight if she regretted the way it was handled. And I think this was also in the media, where she said in the conversation that there were aspects of this that she in hindsight would have liked to dealt with differently. But we also know that Myanmar is a very complex country in the sense that 25% of the MPs are not elected by the people. These are elected by the military. So that's part of the equation. I think on the larger refugee issue, we have now around 65 million people that are refugees globally. I think we all have a responsibility to deal with this.
Mr. Brende, is Europe, in your opinion, committing the same mistakes of the past by shunning people who seem to threaten the very essence of the socio-economic fabric in these societies? Is that the mistake that's being done, or has this become today, being honest, has it become a political necessity to shun some of these people?
And I think this is also a nuanced picture, because I think we also have to recognize that many European countries have taken big responsibility when it comes to receiving refugees. I would, of course, use this opportunity to send a special thank you to the host country, Turkey. No country have received so many refugees globally as Turkey, more than 4 million. Not only Syrians, but Iraqis, people from Afghanistan. We also have the same in Jordan, Lebanon. But let's not forget that Germany received 1 million. We have also seen that Scandinavian countries, Sweden received many hundred thousands. If you look at a proportion of population, Norway, my country, we received, when we were in government, when I was in government, we were among the top countries if you looked at this compared to population. We are 5 million people, and we received many. But also, as was addressed here, we cannot solve this problem without going to the root causes. And the root causes are proxy conflicts. The root causes is poverty, illiteracy, and all this has to be dealt with. Also, when it comes to creating opportunities for younger generation.
But let me turn to you now, Pierre Kaim-Buhl, because when we think about refugees, I think one people more than any other in the world almost symbolizes this issue, the Palestinian refugees. I know your organization, UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, has been going through a tough moment recently. You and I met last week on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York, and we talked about this quote-unquote survival crisis, now that the United States has decided not to give the chunk of the aid that used to be given to UNRWA, over $300 million. We talked about what this represents for your organization. Tell us in human terms what it means.
Whenever I travel around the world, when I think about how can one best communicate what it means today to be a Palestinian refugee, and what does it mean for a community to have been in a refugee situation for 7 decades, I think it's easy if one would ask anybody in this room. We can think about, in each of our countries, what have been the landmarks of human history since the end of World War II. And if we would each take a few minutes, we would think about some very important moments. Some of us might choose to note the beginning and the end of apartheid, or desegregation in the United States. We could list the building and the fall of the Berlin Wall. We could list specific sporting events or cultural events that have happened in different parts of the world. I think it's something like 15 Olympic Games and 17 Football World Cups, and you could list it over that entire period since the end of World War II. And over that entire period, Palestine refugees have been refugees. And I think one of the incredibly important issues is to deeply, and you alluded to it in your opening remarks, to absolutely, resolutely refuse anonymity in suffering during conflict. Because however effectively we talk about the political dynamics of conflict, however we are tempted on the evening news to present the shift of front lines, the movement of airplanes, tanks, and others, the reality is that human beings are at the heart of conflicts. And I cannot accept that one reduces the victims to precisely that, to only victims or to numbers and statistics, as you pointed out. So the first point is there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the decision that was taken by the United States to cut funding to UNRWA was taken for political reasons. It was not taken in relation to our performance, because the last visit that I carried out and had senior level contacts last year in Washington, on the contrary, confirmed a lot of recognition for the work that UNRWA does, for the way in which we do the work, in a very polarized and highly emotional context. And we actually even signed in December last year a new framework agreement of cooperation with the United States. Then the announcement was made on Jerusalem with the issue of the embassy. Then that created a very intense and tense environment between the Palestinian leadership and the United States. And thereafter, the United States decided to cut the funding, all funding to Palestinian-related issues, including the funding to UNRWA, which is, sincerely said, quite unprecedented in my experience in terms of politicization of humanitarian aid. And this is exactly what should be prevented. One should not pursue political objectives with humanitarian funding. That's a very key issue. You know, UNRWA is sometimes blamed for having itself somehow perpetuated the reality of Palestine refugees. And I must say here that nothing has contributed more to this protracted and long duration of the Palestine refugeehood than the inability to resolve the conflict at the heart between Israel and Palestine. And that's just not going to go away. We cannot wish away 5.3 million people, the population of Norway or of Singapore, in the middle of this region, simply by stating that their children and grandchildren don't deserve to be recognized as refugees.
I think that one of the biggest responsibility that as a humanitarian organization we have is to be accountable. Accountable to our donors, accountable to those who we serve. And this is extremely important. And it's a matter of fact that our organization are made by people. And unfortunately, scandal could happen. We are not immune sometimes, this is very sad, some cases of fraud and corruption in the humanitarian organization. So I immediately worked with my colleagues of the board to increase our policies for having a zero tolerance on fraud and corruption, which is a top priority for us in dealing with this at all level, at Geneva level, but also on the ground at field level.
What do you find is the most compelling thing you can say or do to help people realize that we need to move away from this current mindset of raison d'etat, really, which puts and prioritizes the security of borders, to one that prioritizes human lives? What are your thoughts on this?
If I were to go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, I'm pretty sure that we cannot reach them without also mobilizing the private sector. And what you have seen during the last years is also an increasing consciousness in the private sector that you have to take issues related to sustainability, but also to development, gender, also the broader issues very seriously. we're in a multipolar, multi-conceptual world. We're moving into the fourth industrial revolution. But I think we're also moving more from capitalism to talentism. The talents of the people is really what matters in companies. And I think the most talented and bright people would prefer to work for companies that also care about very important values that we already discussed there. And I think if the World Economic Forum, having some of the 1,000 most influential companies in the world as our partners, can push the envelope there, I think we will contribute also in a good way to make sure that the world continues to move in the right direction.
How would you rate, though, the threats facing the world today in order of significance? When you look at climate change, when you look at nuclear war, global inequality, the issue of refugees, and I promised myself not to ask you a big question, but what would be your answer in a nutshell?
We came out with a report half a year ago, three-quarters of a year ago, global risk report that we do produce every year. And out of 9 most pressing risks, 5 of them were related to environment, being oceans, depleted fish stocks, climate change, biodiversity, so that is one. I think also we have to admit that the situation when it comes to trade is very worrisome, because we know that trade has been the driver of growth, and trade has also included emerging markets in the global economy.
Pierre Crahenbuhl, coming to this idea that Borge Brende just ended on, this notion of partnerships, when you look around you, when you look at influential voices within the media, humanitarian organizations, economic organizations, what kinds of partnerships are crucial for you, for UNRWA, not just to change mindsets, but also to raise awareness and to raise the kind of funding that we were talking about earlier?
One thing that strikes me after over a quarter century of working in conflict zones is I think we really need to redevelop a consciousness around the rejection of the notion that wars are inevitable. It is just too simple to tolerate the idea. When you see the human consequences of them, we give in to this notion that wars are inevitable much too easily. And I think it needs for us to rediscover the value, something that Borge Brende knows very well from his years of investment, for example, on the Colombian conflict, that at the end of the day, conflicts are solved by talking to one another. Yeah. And much more should be invested in conflict resolution rather than in conflict management.
But can the private sector, do you think, be incentivized to create employment that would benefit refugee communities?
I think when there is an acute crisis, I think we have to rely on the humanitarian organizations. They should be also sufficiently financed, of course. But when you are building back or you have recovery phase, I think we can also rely more on private sector. I think the whole thinking around humanitarian contributions have changed during the last years. Before, it was unthinkable to contribute with cash, for example. But what we did when you fly in food, fly in all kind of equipments, you also kill the infrastructure that is already there.
I just want to say something about the word dignity, because my biggest discovery when joining UNRWA, after 20 years with the International Red Cross, was not so much about the emergency side of work, the food distributions, the medical assistance, things that you normally associate with armed conflict. It was the education. I have never seen in my life a humanitarian organization commit in this way to education on a large scale. 526,000 boys and girls in UNRWA's education system from Aleppo to Rafah in Gaza. And this is something which allows you to not look at the person only as a victim of violence and dispossession, but also as an actor of his or her own destiny. And there's nothing more powerful than to be able to give these young boys and girls a horizon, a prospect, and something that can allow them to meet with their aspirations.
I was thinking 1 second ago that the 3 men on the podium are all coming from we have all something in common, the Red Cross family. because Borge has been Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross, and Pierre has served for many years. So how important is the world humanity, the first principle of the Red Cross?
So I think we are, in many ways, at the crossroads globally these days. Are we going to continue to believe in a win-win world? What is good for your country is good for my country, and vice versa? Are we going to live in a world where we also would like to include emerging economies in the global economy? Are we going to continue to trade with each other and make a win-win world? Or are we going to choose another path that is not going to create the same kind of opportunities? So thank you for also putting these kind of issues on the agenda here during your conference or summit or forum.